He laughed while signing the divorce papers, thinking I was a penniless nobody. He slid a measly check across the table, mocking my low-paying job and telling me to disappear. But his smug smile froze forever when the judge opened a sealed envelope revealing my trillion-dollar secret, turning his ultimate victory into a financial nightmare that would destroy his entire life. My name is Stella. I am 33 years old, and I spent the last 7 years of my life building a throne for a man who decided to lock me out of the castle. The heavy mahogany table in the divorce mediation room felt like a cold, unforgiving battlefield. The air conditioning hummed quietly, a sharp contrast to the suffocating tension filling the small corporate office. Across from me sat Richard, my soon-to-be ex-husband. At 35, he had just made partner at one of the most ruthless venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. His tailored Italian suit screamed success, a success I had paid for with my own blood, sweat, and youth. Richard leaned back in his expensive leather chair, a sickeningly arrogant smirk playing on his lips. He reached into his designer briefcase, pulled out his leather-bound checkbook, and scribbled a number with his heavy gold fountain pen. With a careless flick of his wrist, he slid the piece of paper across the polished wood. It came to a stop right in front of my folded hands. I looked down at the harsh ink. $5,000. Take the 5 grand, Stella. Richard said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. Go rent a tiny studio apartment in some rundown neighborhood. I am being incredibly generous here. Let us be honest, with your pathetic little job gluing dusty pages together, you could work for the next 10 years and never see this kind of cash at once. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever sacrificed everything for someone who completely underestimated your worth. Trust me, you will want to hear exactly how I made him regret every single word. You are dead weight to me now. Stella. Richard continued, completely ignoring his own lawyer, who shifted uncomfortably beside him. I am closing a $500 million funding round next week. I am stepping into the absolute highest elite circle of society. I cannot have a wife whose biggest career achievement is fixing moldy books in a basement archive. You embarrass me in front of my colleagues. You bring absolutely no value to my personal brand or my future. No value. The harsh words echoed in the quiet room. My mind flashed back to our mid-20s. While Richard was out networking at expensive steakhouses and studying for his Master of Finance, I was running on exactly 3 hours of sleep a night. I worked the early morning shift at a coffee shop, the afternoon shift at a local bookstore, and grueling night shifts entering data just to keep the lights on in our cramped one-bedroom apartment. I paid his expensive tuition. I ironed those cheap clearance rack suits he wore to his first interviews. I cooked him warm meals while I survived on instant noodles. I was the stepping stone he proudly walked all over to reach his current heights. Now that he was comfortably at the top, I was just dirt on the bottom of his shiny designer shoe. Look at yourself, Richard scoffed, gesturing vaguely at my simple beige cardigan and practical slacks. You are 33 years old and you have absolutely nothing to show for your life. You have zero ambition. You are perfectly content breathing in dust mites for minimum wage. I need a partner who understands high-level finance, someone who knows exactly how to navigate extreme wealth, not someone who thinks a $5,000 check is a winning lottery ticket. He thought he knew everything about wealth and power. He thought my job as an antiquarian book restorer was just a sad, dead-end hobby for a simple-minded woman. He had absolutely no idea that my quiet, humble life was a carefully constructed shield. He did not know that the woman sitting across from me quietly taking his verbal abuse was the sole legal heir to Aegis Global, a massive trust fund holding the core patents for modern artificial intelligence infrastructure. He thought he was throwing pennies at a beggar, completely unaware he was insulting a woman whose true net worth was quietly sitting at over $1.2 trillion. I did not cry. I did not scream or throw the insulting check back in his arrogant face. Instead, I calmly picked up the piece of paper, folding it neatly in half with slow, deliberate movements. I looked directly into Richard's eyes, dropping the pathetic facade of the heartbroken, abandoned wife. My voice was completely steady, completely empty of any weakness or emotion he expected to see. $5,000, I said softly, tracing the sharp edge of the folded paper. Are you absolutely sure this is your final offer, Richard? Before Richard could even open his mouth to answer, a booming laugh echoed from the wooden benches at the back of the courtroom gallery. The harsh sound shattered the quiet tension of the room. It was Jamal, Richard's brother-in-law. Jamal was a 32-year-old crypto broker who wore his sudden questionable wealth as loudly as his booming voice. As a black man who had married Richard's younger sister, he constantly sucked up to Richard to gain access to elite venture capital circles. Jamal stood up from the gallery bench, adjusting the cuffs of his bright crimson suit jacket. He made sure everyone in the room caught a glimpse of the oversized, gaudy gold watch strapped to his wrist. Anyone with a trained eye could tell the timepiece was a cheap knockoff, but Jamal paraded it around like it was the crown jewels of England. "Come on, Richard, stop playing games with the charity cases," Jamal called out, his voice practically bouncing off the mahogany walls. "Just make her sign the paper so we can get out of this depressing room. My crypto nodes just hit a massive spike this morning, and I have reservations at a Michelin star restaurant downtown. They have a very strict dress code, so we definitely cannot bring the thrift store queen along with us." I did not even turn around to look at him. Jamal had always been a relentless parasite. For years he ate the warm dinners I cooked, slept on the couch I bought with my hard-earned money, and constantly asked Richard for secret loans from the savings account I built by working 3 jobs. Now that his imaginary internet coins were temporarily up in value, he acted like he was the absolute king of Wall Street. He loved to insult my cheap clothes and my modest lifestyle, completely forgetting who kept him from being evicted just 2 years ago. Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the mediation room swung open again, interrupting the tense silence. The sharp click of designer stilettos announced her arrival before she even spoke a word. It was Sienna. She was 28 years old, the incredibly spoiled daughter of a prominent commercial bank executive, and the exact reason Richard had filed for this divorce. Sienna walked into the room dripping in authentic designer brands, carrying a rare handbag that easily cost more than my entire year's salary at the library archives. She did not even bother to look in my direction. She marched straight past. My chair leaned over the polished mediation table and planted a long theatrical kiss squarely on Richard's lips, right in front of the mediator. "Am I late, baby?" Sienna purred, running her perfectly manicured fingers through his haircut. "Daddy just approved the bridge loan for your new venture capital fund. The money is locked in. We are officially ready to pop the champagne and celebrate our new life together." Richard beamed his chest, visibly puffing out with extreme pride as he wrapped a possessive arm around her slim waist. "Perfect timing, gorgeous. We are just wrapping up the trash collection right now." Sienna finally turned her perfectly contoured face toward me. Her eyes dragged slowly up and down my sensible beige cardigan and my practical slacks. Her lips curled into a look of absolute, unadulterated disgust. She looked at me the exact way someone might look at a dirty stray dog that had somehow wandered into a high-end luxury boutique. "Oh, you are still sitting here," Sienna said, feigning shock. "Listen to me, Stella. Richard told me you are demanding some sort of financial payout. It is honestly embarrassing to watch you beg. He built his incredible career from the ground up entirely by himself. You were just holding him back." I had to forcefully bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud at her pure ignorance. "Built it from the ground up. I paid every single cent of his tuition. I typed his final thesis while he slept." Sienna sighed, dramatically unclasped her handbag, and pulled out a designer leather wallet. With a look of profound mocking pity, she pinched a crisp $100 bill between 2 fingers. She carelessly tossed it through the air. It fluttered down slowly and landed directly on top of the insulting $5,000 check Richard had given me. "Take that and call a premium cab," Sienna sneered, crossing her arms. "Do not take the public bus today. You look depressed enough as it is. Just sign the divorce papers, take the handout, and let the real adults handle the big money." The room went dead silent. Richard smirked triumphantly. Jamal chuckled loudly from the back row. Even Richard's highly paid lawyer looked down at his legal pad, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to stop his wealthy client from this cruel humiliation. They all waited for me to finally break down. They fully expected me to scream, to cry, or to storm out in a fit of pathetic, jealous rage. Instead, I reached out with a perfectly steady hand. I picked up the crisp $100 bill from the table. I smoothed out the wrinkled corners, folded it neatly in half, and slid it directly into the side pocket of my cheap beige purse. I looked slowly up at Sienna, offering her a calm, chilling smile that instantly made the arrogant smirk vanish from Richard's face. Richard shifted in his expensive leather chair, suddenly uncomfortable under my steady gaze. He cleared his throat loudly and tapped his gold pen against the mahogany table. His high-paid lawyer, a slick man in a pinstripe suit, took that as his cue to wrap things up quickly. The lawyer opened a thick manila folder and pulled out a heavy stack of legal documents. He slid the thick packet across the table, stopping it right next to my purse. "This is the final divorce decree," the lawyer said, his voice smooth and practiced. "However, Richard has instructed me to include a very specific, highly binding post-nuptial addendum. It is a complete and total financial severance agreement." I looked down at the dense paragraphs of legal jargon. I did not need to read the entire document to know exactly what Richard was trying to do. He was terrified. Not of me, but of the paranoid idea that I might somehow come after his newly acquired wealth. "Let me summarize it for you, Stella, since I know complex legal terms confuse you," Richard sneered, leaning forward and planting his elbows aggressively on the table. "This document states that you accept the $5,000 as a complete and final settlement, but more importantly, there is an ironclad clause right there on page 4. It states that both parties completely and permanently waive all rights to any current and future undiscovered assets." Jamal laughed from the gallery, slapping his knee hard. "Smart man, Richard. You always have to protect the bag from the leeches. You cannot let her drain your accounts." Richard nodded, his arrogance returning in full force as he puffed out his chest. "You see, Stella, my venture capital firm is just weeks away from closing a massive $500 million deal. We are securing a major anchor investment from a global tech conglomerate. When that happens, my personal net worth is going to skyrocket into the high 8 figures overnight. I know exactly how women like you operate. You sit back, contribute absolutely nothing, and then 10 years down the line, you try to drag me back into family court. You will claim you deserve a piece of my massive success just because you bought me cheap groceries in graduate school." Sienna wrapped her arms tightly around Richard's neck, resting her chin on his shoulder. "My daddy's bank is backing his whole fund," she said sweetly, glaring at me with pure venom. "Richard is going to be a titan of industry. We are making sure you can never ever try to claim a single penny of the billions he is going to manage. We want you legally locked out of his high-class future forever." I stared at the thick document. "Waive all rights to any current and future undiscovered assets." The wording was absolute. It was legally bulletproof in this state. If Richard signed this paper, he would completely and legally renounce any right to claim my hidden inheritance. He genuinely thought he was building an impenetrable fortress to protect his venture capital money from a broke book restorer. He had absolutely no idea he was actually locking himself out of a $1.2 trillion empire. My heart hammered in my chest, not from sorrow, but from the sheer exhilarating thrill of his profound stupidity. But I could not let him see that excitement. I had to play my part perfectly. I had to make him believe he was ruthlessly forcing me into a corner. I let my shoulders slump forward. I lowered my eyes, staring at the polished wood table, as if I had just been handed a literal death sentence. I allowed my lower lip to tremble just a fraction to sell the performance. I reached out and picked up the heavy gold pen Richard had tossed toward me, letting my fingers shake visibly. Richard the First said, my voice barely above a fragile whisper. I forced a slight waver into my tone, making myself sound terrified and completely desperate. Are you absolutely sure about this? If we sign this specific clause, there is no going back for either of us. You are asking to completely sever all future financial ties no matter what happens. Are you truly certain you want to walk away from any undiscovered assets I might have? The entire room erupted into deafening laughter. Richard threw his head back and laughed so hard his face turned bright red. Sienna giggled uncontrollably into her manicured hand, and Jamal actually stood up from the wooden bench to clap. Undiscovered assets. Richard gasped for air, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. What undiscovered assets, Stella? A secret stash of expired library cards. A hidden collection of moldy poetry books. Do you have a plastic jar of pennies buried in the backyard that you are desperately trying to hide from me? He slammed his hand down flat on the table, the humor vanishing from his face, instantly replaced by pure cold malice. Stop playing pathetic games and sign the paper, Stella. Sign away your rights to my future, take your little check, and get out of my sight. I did not hesitate any longer. With a hand that was trembling just enough to make my performance believable, I pressed the heavy gold fountain pen to the thick, textured paper. The scratch of the nib echoed in the quiet room as I carefully signed my name on the dotted line. With those few strokes of ink, I officially and permanently waived all my rights to any of Richard's future venture capital millions. But infinitely more important, I legally and permanently severed his right to touch a single penny of my inheritance. The moment I lifted the pen from the page, the suffocating tense atmosphere in the room completely shattered, instantly replaced by a sickening wave of jubilant celebration. Jamal actually cheered out loud, a booming sound of victory, as he marched across the room to loudly high-five Richard. Sienna threw her arms around Richard's neck, squealing with absolute delight, planting another theatrical kiss on his cheek. They celebrated exactly as if they had just won a massive lottery jackpot. Richard's slick lawyer quickly snatched the document away from me, inspecting my signature closely with sharp, calculating eyes before giving his client a firm nod of satisfaction. It was done. The ironclad legal trap was officially set, and my arrogant husband had practically begged me to lock him inside it. Richard stood up from his leather chair, proudly buttoning his expensive Italian suit jacket with a look of supreme, unquestionable victory. He looked down at me one last time, no longer bothering to hide his absolute contempt. He had gotten exactly what he wanted, and now I was nothing more than an unpleasant chore he needed to sweep away. You have exactly 2 hours to get your trash out of my house. Stella? Richard ordered, his tone icy and utterly dismissive. I want every single one of those dusty old library books, your cheap thrift store clothes, and all your depressing little antique trinkets, gone before Sienna and I get back from our celebratory lunch. If there is so much as a single worn-out shoelace left behind in my pristine hallway, I am having the landscaping crew throw it directly into the neighborhood incinerator. Do you understand me? Pack your garbage and get out of my sight. I did not answer him. I did not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply picked up my worn, beige purse, the one that now contained his insulting $5,000 check, and Sienna's thrown $100 bill, and stood up from the heavy mahogany table. I turned my back on the three of them, completely ignoring Jamal's loud, mocking goodbye, and Sienna's condescending giggle as she planned their luxury shopping spree. I walked out of the mediation room, my sensible shoes making quiet taps on the hardwood floor, and pushed through the heavy wooden doors into the busy courthouse corridor. I walked past the crowded benches of stressed couples and busy public defenders. I stepped into the elevator, staring blankly at the metal doors as they slid shut, blocking out the last remnants of my old life. The moment the elevator reached the ground floor and I stepped out onto the warm, sunlit courthouse steps, the fragile, heartbroken persona I had been wearing for months instantly melted away. I rolled my shoulders back, letting out a long, steady breath of fresh air. My posture straightened completely. The fake nervous trembling in my hands vanished immediately, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. I was no longer the pathetic, abandoned wife, desperately clinging to a man who despised her. I was no longer the invisible book restorer who counted coupons just to buy groceries. I was Stella, the sole legal heir to the most powerful technology infrastructure conglomerate in the entire world. I reached into the hidden inner pocket of my purse. I completely ignored my cheap, cracked personal cell phone and instead pulled out a sleek, heavy custom-built encrypted device. It was a specialized piece of military-grade hardware that did not exist on any public market directly and securely linked to the highest levels of global finance. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner on the screen. The device glowed to life instantly, bypassing multiple security firewalls in a fraction of a second. I tapped a single highly classified contact name and brought the phone to my ear, listening to the secure line connect through heavily encrypted servers. The voice on the other end answered immediately, professional, sharp, and highly alert. "Good afternoon, Madam Chairwoman." I spoke clearly, my voice ringing with a newfound icy authority that Richard would have never recognized in a million years. "Mr. Sterling," I said, staring out at the busy city street, watching the oblivious crowds hurry past. "Richard just signed the future assets waiver. The legal severance is completely finalized and filed with the mediator." There was a brief, highly satisfying pause on the other end of the line before my chief trustee replied. "Understood, madam. We have been waiting for your green light, awaiting your final instructions." I smiled, a genuine predatory smile that promised absolute destruction. "Unlock the Aegis Global Trust," I commanded smoothly. "It is time to acquire his venture capital firm." I ended the call and slipped the encrypted phone back into the hidden pocket of my purse. The air felt lighter, as if a massive weight had finally been lifted from my shoulders. I hailed a standard city cab, giving the driver the address to the upscale suburban house Richard and I had shared for the last 5 years. It was a house I had painstakingly decorated on a tight budget, turning a sterile, overpriced property into a warm home while he climbed the corporate ladder. Now I had exactly 2 hours to collect my personal belongings before he and Sienna returned. But as the cab pulled up to the manicured curb of the property, I realized Richard had not even given me those 2 hours. My heart hardened at the sight playing out on the pristine green grass. Brenda. My former mother-in-law was standing on the front porch. She was 62 years old, aggressively attempting to cling to her youth with tight, expensive facelifts and heavily branded designer clothing. Right now, her usually pristine posture was hunched over a heavy cardboard box. With a grunt of effort, she tipped the box forward, sending its contents tumbling down the concrete steps and scattering across the front lawn. I stepped out of the cab, my eyes scanning the destruction. She was not just throwing away my clothes, she was deliberately destroying my professional antique restoration tools and my most treasured memory boxes. Highly specialized custom-made bone folders, imported horsehair brushes, and delicate brass binding presses were scattered in the dirt. These were the precise instruments I used for my craft tools that took years to acquire. Next to them lay broken picture frames holding the only surviving photographs of my late parents, the people who had established the trillion-dollar empire I now controlled. Brenda looked up and saw me standing on the sidewalk. Instead of looking guilty, her face twisted into a mask of pure, vicious triumph. She wiped her hands on her expensive silk trousers and marched down the steps, kicking a delicate antique magnifying glass out of her way with the toe of her leather shoe. "Look who finally decided to show up!" Brenda sneered, her voice carrying loudly across the quiet suburban street. Richard called me from the courthouse. He told me you actually signed the waiver and took the $5,000 like a good little peasant. I came over immediately to make sure your absolute garbage was cleared out before Sienna arrives. We cannot have her breathing in the stench of your poverty. I walked slowly onto the grass, carefully stepping over my scattered tools. I looked at Brenda, remembering every single holiday dinner where she had intentionally seated me at the far end of the table. I remembered every backhanded compliment about my cheap clothes, and every time she had loudly lamented that her brilliant, handsome son had thrown his life away on an uncultured orphan. She had spent 7 years treating me like an embarrassing mistake because I did not have a wealthy father to fund Richard's ambitions. Sienna is a proper high-class woman, Brenda continued, placing her hands on her hips. She comes from a real family with a real legacy. Her father is a banking CEO, Stella. Do you even understand what that means? It means she can actually elevate Richard to the elite status he deserves. What could you possibly give him? You have no family, no connections, and no future. You are nothing but an anchor dragging my son down into mediocrity. You should be down on your knees thanking us for letting you live in this beautiful house for as long as you did. She pointed a shaking finger at the scattered boxes on the lawn. Pack up your pathetic little arts and crafts project and get off my son's property. The garbage truck comes tomorrow, but I am not letting this trash ruin our landscaping for another minute. A year ago, her words would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety and self-doubt. I would have scrambled to pick up my broken things, apologizing through tears just to keep the peace. But today, standing on the lawn, with the power of Aegis Global coursing through my veins, Brenda just looked incredibly small. She looked like a foolish, bitter woman, desperately trying to protect a fragile illusion of wealth. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice or scramble to rescue my scattered belongings. I simply stood completely still, letting my eyes sweep over the broken brass tools and the crushed wooden boxes. Then I slowly raised my left arm and checked my watch. You really should not have touched those, Brenda. I said, my voice eerily calm and entirely devoid of the fear she desperately wanted to see. I looked up from my watch and met her angry gaze. Every single one of those antique tools is a registered historical artifact. They are insured for more than your son's entire net worth. Brenda let out a sharp, mocking bark of laughter, completely dismissing my warning. Insured for more than his net worth, she repeated, her voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. You are completely delusional, Stella. Gluing old paper together has finally made you lose your mind. You are just a broke, desperate woman trying to sound important while standing in a pile of her own garbage. Before I could respond to her ignorance, the aggressive roar of a high-performance engine shattered the quiet suburban atmosphere. A sleek, bright red Porsche convertible whipped around the corner and sped up the street, braking sharply before swerving directly into the driveway. The tires screeched against the pavement, stopping just inches from my scattered boxes. The driver's side door swung open and Sienna stepped out, her designer sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly styled blonde hair. She looked around the front yard, her nose crinkling in absolute disgust, as if she had just stepped into a toxic waste dump. She slammed the car door shut, her high heels clicking loudly against the concrete as she walked over to join Brenda on the porch. What is taking so long? Brenda? Sienna whined, crossing her arms over her expensive silk blouse. Richard and I want to host a private dinner party tonight to celebrate the divorce, and I absolutely cannot have my guests looking at this depressing yard sale. I thought you said she was going to quietly pack her trash and leave. Brenda sighed heavily, playing the role of the exhausted, put-upon mother. I am trying, Sienna, dear. But you know how these lower-class people are. They always want to drag things out and cause a scene. She is standing here hallucinating about her dusty old tools being worth millions of dollars. Sienna let out a high-pitched, cruel giggle. She walked down the steps, stopping just a few feet away from me. She looked me up and down with that same expression of profound pity she had used in the courtroom. Listen to me very carefully, Stella Sienna said, pulling her sleek smartphone out of her designer handbag. I'm going to give you exactly 10 minutes to pick up your garbage and get off our property. If you are not gone by the time my phone timer goes off, I am calling the police and having you arrested for trespassing and harassment. I looked at her phone, then back up at her perfectly contoured face. Your property? I asked, keeping my voice completely level. Yes, my property, Sienna snapped back, her eyes flashing with pure arrogance. Richard and I are already finalizing the paperwork to sell this pathetic little starter home. We are upgrading to a $10 million mansion in the exclusive gated community across town. It has a 10-car garage, a private tennis court, and a wine cellar bigger than the apartment you are probably going to rent. You see, Stella, when you marry a man with real ambition, you get to live a real life. She took a step closer, lowering her voice into a vicious, triumphant whisper. You thought you could trap him, did you not? You thought playing the supportive wife would guarantee you a piece of his success. But you forgot one crucial detail. In the real world, money only respects money. My father is the chief executive officer of the largest commercial bank in the state. His bank is the primary financial backer for Richard's new venture capital fund. We hold all the cards. We have the capital, we have the connections, and we have the power. Sienna gestured broadly with her hand, encompassing the house, the luxury car, and herself. Together, Richard and my father are building a financial empire. They are completely untouchable royalty in the business world. And you, Stella, are just an annoying mosquito that we have officially swatted away. So hurry up and pack your little hobby kits before I have the cops drag you away in handcuffs. I stared at her, feeling a deep, thrilling sense of anticipation pooling in my stomach. She was bragging about her father's bank backing Richard's fund. She thought that made them invincible royalty. She had absolutely no idea that just 20 minutes ago, I had authorized Aegis Global to execute a hostile takeover of that exact same bank. They were not untouchable royalty. They were already bankrupt, and they did not even know it yet. Sienna unlocked her phone, her thumb hovering over the dial pad to call the local police. But before she could press a single number, a deep, heavy rumbling sound echoed from the end of the street. It was not the high-pitched whine of a sports car. It was the heavy, intimidating growl of massive diesel engines. Sienna and Brenda both stopped talking, turning their heads to look down the road. 3 massive, jet-black, unmarked armored trucks turned the corner in perfect synchronization. They were military-grade vehicles, the kind used to transport gold reserves and highly sensitive state secrets. The convoy rolled slowly and deliberately up the quiet suburban street, the deep hum of their engines vibrating through the ground beneath our feet. Sienna frowned, taking a step back as the massive vehicles approached our driveway. "What on earth is that?" she muttered, her arrogant confidence momentarily slipping. The first armored truck did not pass by. Instead, it swung sharply into the driveway, its heavy reinforced bumper stopping just inches away from the bright red paint of Sienna's expensive Porsche, completely blocking her car in. The second and third trucks parked along the curb, boxing the entire property in a solid, impenetrable wall of black steel. The heavy doors of the armored trucks swung open in perfect unison. Instead of standard moving company workers in dirty t-shirts and jeans, a team of 12 elite logistics professionals stepped out onto the pavement. They were all dressed in immaculate, tailored black suits with discreet earpieces, looking more like a specialized government security detail than a packing crew. They moved with absolute precision, their expressions completely unreadable as they assessed the perimeter of the property. Sienna let out a nervous scoff, her grip tightening on her expensive designer handbag. Brenda took a cautious step backward, suddenly looking very small on her own front porch. "What is the meaning of this?" Brenda demanded, her voice losing its previous venom and wavering with genuine uncertainty. "Are these your people?" "Sienna?" Sienna shook her head frantically, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the soft leather of her purse. "No, of course not. Why would my father send military trucks to a suburban neighborhood?" I ignored their panicked whispering. The lead logistics officer, a tall man with sharp features and a crisp white shirt beneath his suit jacket, walked briskly up the driveway. He did not look at Sienna's bright red Porsche. He completely ignored Brenda standing frozen on the porch. He walked straight past them, his polished shoes crunching softly on the concrete, and stopped precisely 3 feet in front of me. Without a single word of hesitation, the tall man bowed perfectly at a strict 90-degree angle. "Good afternoon, Madam Chairwoman," he said, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute unwavering respect. "We apologize for the delay. Traffic on the interstate was slightly congested. Our preservation team is ready to secure your assets." I nodded, keeping my posture entirely straight and my expression neutral. "Proceed," I commanded softly. With a sharp hand signal from the leader, the rest of the suited team moved into action. They pulled heavy metallic cases from the back of the armored trucks. These were not cardboard moving boxes. They were high-tech, climate-controlled preservation vaults lined with impact-resistant foam, the exact kind used to transport priceless museum artifacts and crown jewels. The team members snapped on pristine white cotton gloves. They spread out across the lawn and began carefully lifting my scattered antique restoration tools from the dirt. One agent used a soft, specialized brush to gently sweep grass clippings off my brass binding press before placing it securely into a custom-molded foam slot. Another agent carefully gathered the broken picture frames containing photos of my parents, treating the shattered glass with the utmost reverence, as if handling ancient relics. They worked in absolute silence, treating every single item Brenda had called garbage with the highest level of professional care. For a long moment, Brenda and Sienna were completely paralyzed by shock. They stood on the porch with their mouths hanging open, watching men in expensive suits meticulously pack up old woodworking tools and dusty book covers. But then Sienna's brain scrambled to find a logical explanation. The idea that I could actually command this level of power was completely impossible for her spoiled, narrow mind to comprehend. She let out a loud, mocking laugh that shattered the quiet efficiency of the packing team. "Oh my God, Brenda!" Sienna gasped, slapping her hand against her thigh in pure amusement. "Do you see what is happening here?" She completely lost her mind. She actually took Richard's $5,000 settlement check and blew the entire thing on hiring a bunch of cheap actors to come pack up her trash. Brenda's face instantly relaxed, her previous fear washing away, replaced by a look of profound, mocking pity. She placed a hand over her chest and sighed. "Stella, this is honestly the most pathetic thing I have ever witnessed in my entire life. Did you really think renting some fake security guards and fancy metal boxes would make us jealous? You rented a moving crew to pack up trash. You are literally wasting the only money you have left in the world just to put on a fake show for us. You are going to be completely bankrupt by tomorrow morning." Sienna pulled out her phone again, pointing the camera directly at me. "I have to record this for Richard. He is going to die laughing when he sees you paying men in suits to pack up your moldy library junk. You are such a desperate, broke loser, Stella." I did not flinch. I let them laugh. I let them point their cameras and hurl their insults, knowing perfectly well that their entire world was currently collapsing behind the scenes. The team leader completely ignored the two laughing women on the porch. He stepped forward, pulling a sleek, encrypted titanium tablet from his inside jacket pocket. He tapped the screen twice and held it out to me with both hands. "Madam Chairwoman," he said, his voice easily cutting through Sienna's obnoxious giggling. "The transfer of the $1.2 trillion holding company is complete. Where to next, ma'am?" I looked at the glowing screen of the titanium tablet, verifying the encrypted signatures that officially placed the absolute power of Aegis Global directly into my hands. "Take my personal artifacts to the central vault at the primary estate," I instructed the team leader, my voice steady and commanding. "I will follow shortly." "Understood, Madam Chairwoman," he replied, bowing his head slightly before turning to coordinate his men. Sienna stopped giggling. She and Brenda exchanged confused glances, still desperately trying to convince themselves this was all an elaborate, pathetic prank paid for by my $5,000 divorce check. But before Sienna could open her mouth to hurl another insult, the loud, aggressive roar of a modified engine shattered the neighborhood's quiet atmosphere once again. Richard's sleek black sports car turned the corner, closely followed by Jamal's gaudy yellow SUV. The two vehicles screeched to a halt right behind the blockade of military-grade armored trucks. The doors swung open, and Richard and Jamal stepped out into the street. They were both practically vibrating with arrogant, triumphant energy, completely oblivious to the heavy tension lingering in the air. Jamal was waving a thick, unlit cigar in the air, his loud voice booming across the lawn before he even reached the driveway. "I am telling you, Richard, we are officially in the big leagues now," Jamal shouted, clapping his brother-in-law hard on the shoulder. "My crypto mining servers just secured a massive exclusive hosting contract with Aegis Global Data Centers. Do you have any idea how much bandwidth that gives me? I am going to be minting internet gold while I sleep. We are going to be buying matching yachts by Christmas." Richard laughed aggressively, adjusting his expensive silk tie as he walked up the concrete path. "Matching yachts is just the beginning, Jamal. My venture capital firm is finally getting noticed by the absolute top tier. I actually got a call from an insider at Aegis Global this morning. Word on the street is that their mysterious new chairman just officially took over the entire trillion-dollar holding company today. I am currently pulling every single string I have to secure a private face-to-face meeting with him. If I can get the new chairman of Aegis to anchor my new fund, I will be the most powerful financial titan in the city." They were so blinded by their own greed and self-importance that they did not even process the scene playing out right in front of them until they reached the edge of the lawn. Richard stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes darting from the massive black armored trucks to the elite-suited men carefully packing my antique tools into high-tech preservation vaults. Jamal lowered his unlit cigar, a wide, mocking grin spreading across his face. "Well, well, well. What do we have here?" Richard let out a sharp, cruel bark of laughter. He looked at me, his eyes practically dancing with malicious delight. He completely ignored the high-end quality of the logistics team and jumped straight to the most insulting conclusion his narrow mind could formulate. "I knew it," Richard sneered, pointing an accusing finger at me. "I knew you were hiding massive, crippling debt from me, Stella. You finally defaulted on all those secret credit cards you used to buy this useless antique garbage, did you not? Look at this. The bank actually sent a high-end debt collection agency to forcefully repossess your pathetic little hobby kits. This is absolutely hilarious. Thank God I made you sign that future assets waiver today, or these repo guys would be coming after my venture capital money next." Jamal doubled over laughing, slapping his knee. "This is pure comedy. The thrift store queen is getting forcefully evicted by the repo man. I guess that $5,000 settlement check did not cover your outstanding debts, did it, sister-in-law?" Sienna rushed down the porch steps, wrapping her arms around Richard's waist and kissing his cheek. "Oh, baby, it is even more pathetic than that. She is completely delusional. She actually tried to tell my mother and me that these repo men were her personal employees. She is having a total mental breakdown." Richard sneered, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "Pack up your repossessed trash and get off my lawn, Stella. I have a very important phone call to make to the Aegis Global Executive Board, and I cannot be distracted by your financial ruin." I did not defend myself. I did not correct his incredibly foolish assumption. I simply smiled, a cold, razor-sharp smile that made the arrogant grin falter on Jamal's face for a fraction of a second. Right on cue, a pristine, elongated black Maybach glided silently up the street, pulling to a smooth stop right beside the armored trucks. A driver in a crisp uniform stepped out and opened the heavy rear door for me. I walked past Richard, leaving him standing in the dirt with his new mistress. I stepped into the luxurious leather interior of the Maybach. Before the driver closed the door, I rolled down the tinted window and looked directly into Jamal's mocking eyes. I hope you read the strict termination clauses on those new server contracts, Jamal. I said, my voice eerily calm and precise. Jamal frowned, his thick cigar drooping slightly. What are you talking about? I let the tinted window roll up slowly, sealing me inside the quiet sanctuary of the luxury car. The engine purred to life, and as the Maybach pulled away from the curb, I left them standing in the shadow of the armored trucks, completely unaware that the mysterious chairman they were desperately trying to impress had just driven away. Back on the pristine suburban lawn, a brief, confused silence fell over the group as the black Maybach disappeared around the corner. Jamal stared down the empty street, his brow furrowed in sudden unease. What did she mean by termination clauses? He muttered, the unlit cigar dangling loosely from his fingers. Does she actually know someone at the server farm? Richard let out a loud, dismissive scoff, clapping Jamal on the back to break the tension. Are you seriously letting her get into your head, Jamal? She is a desperate, broke woman who just got evicted and dumped on the exact same day. She is completely losing her mind. She probably heard you talking about your crypto servers and just threw out some random business words to sound intimidating. It is pathetic, honestly. Sienna practically skipped back up the driveway, her designer heels clicking happily. Richard is right, Jamal. Do not let her ruin our mood. She is just a bitter ex-wife trying to cause drama because she has absolutely nothing else to live for. Brenda emerged from the front door of the house carrying a silver tray with 4 crystal flutes and an expensive bottle of imported champagne. Let us focus on what really matters, Brenda announced cheerfully, her previous fear of the armored trucks completely forgotten. We are officially rid of the dead weight. To my brilliant son, his beautiful new bride-to-be, and a future filled with absolute luxury. Richard grabbed the heavy green bottle, peeled back the gold foil, and popped the cork with a loud, celebratory bang. The champagne bubbled over, spilling onto the manicured grass as they laughed and clinked their crystal glasses together. They stood in the warm afternoon sun, drinking expensive wine and celebrating their perceived victory, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine suspended directly above their heads. Inside the soundproof, climate-controlled cabin of the Maybach, the noise of their obnoxious celebration faded into absolute silence. The plush leather seats absorbed the subtle vibrations of the road as the driver smoothly navigated toward the highway. I settled back into the deep cushions, feeling a profound sense of clarity. I reached into my bag and pulled out the encrypted titanium tablet the logistics leader had handed me earlier. The biometric scanner read my thumbprint, and the massive, sprawling financial network of Aegis Global illuminated the screen. For the first time in my life, I was not looking at a meager checking account or a tight grocery budget. I was looking at the intricate trillion-dollar circulatory system of the American economy, and I held the scalpel. I tapped the screen, accessing the corporate intelligence database. I typed in Jamal's full name first. Within a fraction of a second, his entire financial existence materialized before my eyes. Jamal loved to brag about his massive crypto wealth, but the data told a very different, highly embarrassing story. His entire mining operation was built on massive, high-interest credit. He had rented premium top-tier bandwidth from Aegis Global data centers, gambling everything on a volatile coin spike. He did not actually own anything. He was just renting space in my digital house, and his contract included a standard immediate termination clause for high-risk accounts. If those servers went offline for even 24 hours, his leveraged trades would collapse, leaving him millions of dollars in debt. Next, I pulled up the financial dossier for Sienna's father, the powerful commercial bank executive she was so incredibly proud of. Sienna believed her family was untouchable royalty. But looking at the bank's internal ledgers, I saw a rotting foundation. Her father's bank was dangerously over-leveraged, having issued far too many high-risk loans to aggressive venture capitalists, exactly like Richard. To cover his tracks and maintain liquidity, her father had borrowed heavily from a massive anonymous institutional lender. I traced the corporate shell companies, hiding that institutional lender, peeling back the layers one by one until the ultimate parent company was revealed. It was Aegis Global. Sienna's father owed hundreds of millions of dollars directly to my trust. The very money Richard was relying on to launch his new venture capital fund was in reality my money. They had built their entire arrogant, elitist empire on a financial fault line that I controlled. They thought they had starved me out of their castle, not realizing I owned the bank that held the mortgage to their entire reality. A cold, deeply satisfying smile spread across my face. I tapped the secure communication icon on the tablet connecting directly to the executive boardroom of Aegis Global. Mr. Harrison, my chief trustee, answered on the first ring. I have reviewed the relevant portfolios, Mr. Harrison. I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calm. The overlapping liabilities are exactly as I suspected. It is time to start cleaning house. Awaiting your orders, Madam Chairwoman, he replied. I looked out the tinted window of the Maybach, watching the city skyline approach. Initiate a massive margin call on Sienna's father's commercial bank. I commanded, my tone completely devoid of mercy. Demand the immediate repayment of all outstanding institutional loans before the end of the business day, and contact the server farms. Shut down every single one of Jamal's crypto mining nodes immediately due to a high-risk credit violation. Let us see exactly how they enjoy the weekend. By Monday evening, the fallout from my corporate commands had already begun to silently rip through their arrogant lives. I stood in front of a full-length mirror in the master suite of the Aegis Global Private Estate, adjusting the delicate diamond clasp of my custom-tailored emerald evening gown. It was a masterpiece of haute couture, completely unrecognizable from the sensible beige cardigans I wore just a few days ago. Tonight was Richard's grand coming-out party, a massive gala he was hosting at the most exclusive five-star hotel in the city to celebrate his new venture capital fund. I knew exactly how he operated. He had invited every single major player in the financial district, desperately hoping to court Aegis Global into becoming his primary anchor investor. He thought he was throwing a coronation. He had no idea he was actually hosting his own corporate funeral. I arrived at the hotel in the Maybach, bypassing the main entrance entirely. My security detail escorted me through a private service elevator directly up to the VIP lounge overlooking the grand ballroom. Below me, the party was in full swing. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the wealthy crowd. Waiters navigated through the room carrying trays of expensive caviar and imported champagne. From my vantage point on the balcony, I easily spotted Richard. He was standing near the center of the room, completely in his element, acting like an absolute king. He wore a crisp new tuxedo, laughing loudly and aggressively, shaking hands with older established billionaires, desperately trying to prove he belonged in their circle. Sienna was right by his side, practically glowing with smug satisfaction. She was draped in a silver sequined dress that caught the light with every step, her arm linked tightly with his. She looked exactly like the wealthy trophy wife she had always aspired to be, completely unaware that her father's banking empire was currently hemorrhaging cash because of the margin call I had initiated on Friday. But it was Jamal who caught my eye. Unlike Richard and Sienna, Jamal looked absolutely miserable. He was standing near the open bar, sweating profusely through his bright blue velvet dinner jacket. He kept frantically checking his phone, swiping the screen with trembling fingers, and downing his drink entirely too fast. I knew exactly why he was panicking. His crypto mining servers had been completely dark for over 48 hours. Without that massive influx of cheap bandwidth, his leveraged trades were rapidly collapsing. He was hemorrhaging millions of dollars by the hour, but he was far too proud and far too terrified to admit his absolute failure in front of Richard's elite guests. He was trying desperately to keep up appearances, laughing nervously at jokes he did not hear, and pretending he was still the king of the crypto world. I watched Richard pull out his phone, his face lighting up as he read a new message. He quickly excused himself from a conversation and pulled Sienna and Jamal aside, his voice carrying over the low hum of the party. Listen to me, both of you. Richard said, his eyes wide with frantic excitement. I just got a text from the executive proxy handling the Aegis Global account. The new chairman of the trust is actually in the building right now. They are upstairs in the VIP lounge. Jamal wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, looking desperate. Are you serious, Richard? You have to get up there. You have to lock down that investment tonight. If you get Aegis money, we are set for life. I could really use a win right now. Sienna gasped, clutching Richard's arm tightly. Oh my God, baby, this is it. This is your moment. You have to go up there and show them exactly why you are the best investment in this entire city. Richard puffed out his chest, straightening his bow tie with supreme confidence. Do not worry. I know exactly how to handle these old money billionaires. They respect aggressive ambition. I am going to go up to that lounge, introduce myself, and walk out of there with a $500 million commitment. You two stay here and mingle. I will be right back with the greatest news of our lives. He turned sharply on his heel, signaling to the security guard guarding the velvet rope at the base of the VIP staircase. I watched from the shadows of the balcony as he flashed his host credentials, completely blind to the reality waiting for him at the top of the stairs. I stepped away from the railing and walked back into the softly lit luxury of the private lounge, taking a seat on a plush leather sofa. I crossed my legs, smoothing the fabric of my emerald gown, and waited for my arrogant ex-husband to come begging for my money. Richard confidently marched up the curved velvet-lined staircase, but he was not alone for long. I heard the frantic clicking of designer heels and heavy footsteps quickly following him. Sienna and Jamal simply could not contain their desperate greed and overwhelming anxiety. Ignoring Richard's strict instructions to stay downstairs, they had pushed past the security guard, eager to get a glimpse of the trillion-dollar savior they thought would rescue their crumbling finances. The three of them burst through the double doors of the VIP lounge, their eyes wide and practically darting around the room like starving animals looking for a meal. The private lounge was massive, decorated with dark mahogany, imported leather, and priceless modern art. It was designed for absolute discretion, keeping the true elite completely separated from the loud, desperate networking happening in the ballroom below. Richard aggressively smoothed his tuxedo jacket, pasting on his most charming and practiced smile. He scanned the dimly lit room, clearly searching for an older, distinguished gentleman, a silver-haired titan of industry. Instead, his eyes landed on a seating area in the far corner, completely cordoned off by four towering, broad-shouldered men in immaculate black suits. Richard's face lit up with greedy anticipation. He nudged Sienna, pointing toward the heavy security detail. That has to be him, Richard whispered loudly, his voice trembling with excitement. Only a trillion-dollar chairman travels with that kind of personal muscle. Follow my lead and let me do the talking. He practically jogged across the expensive Persian rug, with Sienna and Jamal trailing closely behind him. As they approached the leather sofa, Richard cleared his throat, projecting his voice to sound confident and commanding. Excuse me, gentlemen, Richard said smoothly to my security detail. I am Richard, the host of tonight's gala and the founder of the venture capital fund you are currently evaluating. I received word that the chairman was interested in a private meeting. My guards did not move a single muscle. They stood like absolute statues, their cold eyes staring right through him. Frustrated by their silence, Richard took a bold step forward, trying to peer around the broad shoulders of my lead security officer to see the person sitting quietly on the sofa. I set my crystal champagne flute down on the glass coffee table with a soft, deliberate clink. I raised my hand slightly, giving my guards the silent signal to step aside. The imposing men parted perfectly down the middle, revealing me to my ex-husband and his panicked entourage. I remained seated, leaning back against the plush leather, my custom emerald gown draping elegantly over the cushions. The delicate diamonds at my throat caught the ambient light, sparkling with a quiet, undeniable power. Richard stopped dead in his tracks. The practiced, charming smile instantly melted right off his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. His jaw actually dropped, Sienna let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Jamal blinked rapidly, rubbing his eyes as if he were staring at a mirage. For a long, deeply satisfying moment, the three of them were completely paralyzed by the sight of the woman they had thrown away like garbage just 3 days ago, now dripping in wealth they could not even begin to comprehend. But Richard's shock did not last long. His narrow, arrogant mind simply could not process the truth staring him right in the face. Instead of realizing the immense danger he was in, his shock quickly curdled into violent, explosive rage. He genuinely believed his own twisted narrative. He thought I was still the pathetic, heartbroken book restorer who could not live without him. "Are you out of your absolute mind, Stella?" Richard hissed, his face turning an angry shade of red. "How did you get past the door staff? Did you actually take the $5,000 settlement check I gave you and blow it on renting a fake designer dress to sneak in here?" Sienna stepped forward, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You are completely psychotic, Stella. You followed us here. You are trying to ruin Richard's big night because you are insanely jealous of his success in our relationship." Richard stepped closer, his fists clenched aggressively at his sides. "I know exactly what you are doing," he spat, his voice echoing in the quiet lounge. "You thought you could sneak up here, corner me away from the crowd, and beg me to take you back. You thought if you dressed up and hired some fake bouncers, I would suddenly realize what I threw away. You are absolutely pathetic. I am closing a $500 million deal tonight with Aegis Global. I am about to be a titan. I will give you exactly 5 seconds to walk out of this hotel before I have the real security drag you out by your hair and have you arrested for stalking." Jamal tried to laugh, but his voice cracked, betraying his absolute panic over his failing servers. "Yeah, go home, Stella. You are embarrassing yourself in front of the real money." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or try to defend myself against their ridiculous accusations. I simply picked up my crystal flute, took a slow, elegant sip of the expensive vintage champagne, and looked Richard directly in his furious eyes. "I belong in the VIP lounge, Richard," I said, my voice dripping with cold, terrifying authority. "The real question is, who let a mid-level fund manager like you up here?" Richard stood completely frozen, his mouth opening and closing as his brain struggled to process my words. But Jamal, who had been sweating through his velvet jacket all evening, suddenly snapped under the immense pressure of his failing finances. He stepped around Richard, his face twisted in an ugly, desperate snarl. He held a full crystal glass of dark bourbon in his right hand. He looked at my pristine, custom-tailored emerald gown, and his eyes lit up with a petty, vindictive rage. "Who do you think you are talking to?" Jamal barked, his voice loud and erratic. "You think you can rent a shiny dress and suddenly talk down to us? You are nothing, Stella. Let me help you take off that fake costume right now." With a sudden, violent motion, Jamal threw his arm forward, aiming to launch the sticky, dark liquor directly onto my chest. But he did not even make it halfway. Before the liquid could even leave the rim of the glass, the towering lead security officer standing to my left moved with terrifying speed. His massive hand shot out like a steel trap, clamping down viciously onto Jamal's wrist. The officer twisted Jamal's arm backward at a sharp, unnatural angle. Jamal let out a high-pitched inches away from the hem of my gown. The bourbon splashed harmlessly onto the carpet inches away from the hem of my gown. The security officer did not let go. He pressed his thumb precisely into a nerve on Jamal's wrist, forcing the large man to his knees right in the middle of the VIP lounge. "Let go of me!" Jamal screamed, tears of pain instantly springing to his eyes as he struggled weakly against the guard's iron grip. "This is assault! You are breaking my arm! Richard, call the police right now! They are attacking me!" Richard finally snapped out of his daze, puffing up his chest and stepping forward aggressively. "Take your hands off my brother-in-law," Richard demanded, pointing a trembling finger at the stoic guard. "I am the host of the massive gala downstairs. I have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars at this hotel tonight. I will have you all thrown in jail for this." The loud commotion and the sound of shattering glass had immediately drawn attention. The heavy mahogany doors of the VIP lounge swung open again, and the hotel general manager rushed in, followed by two of the hotel's own security staff. He was a distinguished older man in a pristine tuxedo, looking incredibly panicked by the disturbance in his most exclusive suite. Jamal saw the manager and immediately started yelling even louder. "Help me! This crazy woman snuck in here with fake security guards and they are assaulting me. I want her arrested. I want her thrown out on the street." Richard crossed his arms, looking at the manager with absolute arrogance. "You need to handle this immediately," Richard instructed in his best commanding voice. "This woman is a trespasser. She is harassing my family. Remove her and her hired thugs from the premises right now, or I am pulling my entire event from your hotel." The general manager did not even look at Richard. He completely ignored Jamal, who was still kneeling on the floor and whining in pain. Instead, the manager rushed past them, his face pale with sheer terror. He stopped right in front of the glass coffee table, clasped his hands tightly in front of him, and bowed deeply toward the leather sofa where I sat. "Madam," the manager gasped, his voice trembling with profound apology. "I am so incredibly sorry. I had absolutely no idea these aggressive individuals had bypassed the downstairs security check to bother you. Are you completely unharmed? Shall I have the local authorities remove them from the property immediately?" Richard blinked, completely stunned. "What are you doing?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking. "Why are you bowing to my ex-wife? She is a broke librarian." The manager finally stood up straight and turned his head to glare at Richard with absolute disdain. "I strongly suggest you lower your voice, sir. You are currently yelling at the majority shareholder of this entire luxury resort property. If she wishes it, your little party downstairs will be shut down, and you will be permanently banned from every single one of our global locations." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the small group. Jamal stopped whining. The security guard finally released his wrist, letting him slump onto the floor in a pathetic heap. Sienna looked back and forth between the manager and me, her perfectly contoured face contorted in disbelief. But even now, faced with indisputable proof of my power, Richard's fragile ego refused to accept the truth. He looked at my expensive gown, my diamond jewelry, and the terrified hotel manager. A twisted, deeply misogynistic smile slowly spread across Richard's face as he forcefully convinced himself of the only narrative his brain could handle. "Oh, I see exactly what is happening here," Richard said, letting out a dark, mocking laugh. "You did not inherit anything, Stella. You finally found someone to fund your life. You are sleeping with the real chairman of Aegis Global, are you not? You found some rich, pathetic old man who owns this hotel, and you convinced him to let you play dress-up to get revenge on me." I stared at him, marveling at the sheer depth of his delusion. His fragile ego simply could not process the fact that a woman he considered beneath him was actually holding the keys to the kingdom. He would rather invent a disgusting, misogynistic fantasy than accept his own profound miscalculation. Before I could even open my mouth to completely shatter his pathetic illusion, a sharp, piercing ringtone echoed through the tense VIP lounge. It was Sienna's designer smartphone. She jumped, slightly startled by the loud noise cutting through the heavy silence. She pulled the phone out of her expensive clutch, glancing at the screen with intense annoyance. It was her father, the powerful commercial banking executive she had been bragging about for months. Sienna rolled her eyes, assuming he was calling to ask how Richard's grand networking event was going. She tapped the screen and brought the phone to her ear, letting out a dramatic sigh. "Daddy, we are right in the middle of a very important confrontation." Sienna whined, her voice dripping with spoiled entitlement. But the voice on the other end of the line was not the confident, booming tone of a banking titan. It was the weak, wheezing gasp of a man whose entire universe had just violently collapsed. Through the quiet hum of the lounge, I could faintly hear the chaotic sounds of medical monitors blaring and sirens wailing in the background. Sienna's annoyed expression vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. The blood completely drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her pale and trembling. "What do you mean you are in an ambulance?" Sienna screamed, her voice cracking hysterically. "What do you mean the bank is gone?" "Daddy, please slow down. I cannot understand you." The entire room watched in stunned silence as Sienna fell apart. She clutched her head, the designer phone pressed tightly against her ear as she listened to the horrifying details of her father's massive downfall. He was suffering a severe heart attack. His commercial bank, the untouchable financial fortress she had built her entire fake identity around, had just been completely gutted. An anonymous institutional lender had suddenly executed a hostile takeover, buying out all of his toxic debt and demanding immediate total repayment in cash. Federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division were currently raiding his corporate headquarters, seizing assets and preparing sweeping fraud charges. Sienna dropped her phone. It bounced off the thick Persian rug, the screen cracking instantly. She collapsed to her knees, completely ruining the hem of her silver sequined dress. She grabbed Richard by his tuxedo jacket, digging her manicured nails into the expensive fabric, pulling him down toward her. "Richard, you have to help us." Sienna sobbed, her makeup running down her face in dark streaks. "Aegis Global just destroyed my father. They bought all his debt and called in the loans. He is bankrupt. He is going to federal prison. You have to use your new venture capital fund to bail him out. You have to save my family right now." Richard stood completely paralyzed, staring down at the hysterical woman clinging to his legs. He did not reach down to comfort her. He did not promise to save her father. Instead, a sickening realization visibly washed over his arrogant face. The color drained from his cheeks as the mathematical reality of his situation finally clicked in his narrow mind. His new venture capital fund, the massive financial vehicle he had paraded around all night, did not actually have any liquid cash yet. It was entirely backed by promises and bridge loans from one single source. That source was Sienna's father's bank. If the bank was completely bankrupt and seized by federal agents, Richard's accounts were instantly frozen. His entire fund was dead in the water. He was suddenly millions of dollars in the hole, standing in a rented five-star ballroom that he absolutely could not pay for. His breathing turned ragged. He stumbled backward, ripping his jacket out of Sienna's desperate grip, completely ignoring her loud, agonizing sobs on the floor. "My money!" Richard gasped, clutching his chest as if he were having a panic attack of his own. "My accounts are tied to that bank. Everything is frozen, as if the universe itself was demanding ultimate immediate justice." Richard's phone vibrated violently in his tuxedo pocket. He practically tore the phone out, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unlock the screen. He opened his secure email application. It was a high-priority encrypted message directly from the executive board of Aegis Global. I sat back on the leather sofa, taking another sip of my champagne, watching his entire life shatter into irreparable pieces. Richard stared at the glowing screen, his eyes wide and hollow. He read the short, brutal message out loud, his voice barely a terrified whisper. "Your funding is denied. Your firm is facing an audit. The chairman will see you tomorrow at the final divorce asset division hearing. Your funding is denied. Your firm is facing an audit. The chairman will see you tomorrow at the final divorce asset division hearing." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Richard stared at his phone as if it had burned his hand. He read the sentence again, his brain failing to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster. Jamal scrambled over to look at the screen. Sienna was still on the floor, gasping for air between heavy sobs, her ruined makeup smudged across her cheeks. The three of them formed a pathetic tableau of sudden ruin. Their entire financial lives, the arrogant foundations they had built their identities upon, were collapsing simultaneously. It was a perfectly synchronized demolition, yet none of them had the intelligence to connect the destruction to me. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that the architect of their demise was sitting just 10 feet away, peacefully finishing a glass of vintage champagne. I set my empty crystal flute on the glass table. Without saying a word, I stood up. My security detail instantly formed a protective wall around me, guiding me toward the private exit. Richard, Jamal, and Sienna were too consumed by their own panic to even notice me leaving. They were drowning. I walked out of the VIP lounge, stepped into the private elevator, and left them to suffocate in the wreckage of their own greed. The rest of their night was a frantic, miserable blur of absolute desperation. According to the security reports my intelligence team forwarded to me later, Richard did not even go downstairs to cancel his own party. He abandoned his elite guests in the grand ballroom and fled the hotel through a service corridor. The three of them retreated to Richard's house, locking themselves in his home office to begin a marathon of frantic phone calls. Jamal spent hours screaming at customer service representatives trying to get his crypto nodes back online. Every single operator told him the exact same thing. His account was permanently flagged for high-risk credit violations, and his bandwidth contract was terminated. His digital wallets were rapidly draining as his leveraged positions were forcibly liquidated. By 3 a.m, Jamal's net worth was effectively zero. He threw his phone against the wall, shattering it into pieces. Sienna paced the floor barefoot, frantically trying to contact her father's legal team. She finally got through to a junior associate who delivered the crushing reality. Federal agents had frozen all of her family's personal accounts. Her credit cards were already declined. The $10 million mansion she and Richard were supposedly buying was off the table. The associate warned her that her luxury sports car was technically a corporate asset and would be repossessed by noon. She was officially cut off, left with nothing but the designer dress she was wearing. Richard aggressively dialed his own firm's compliance officers, desperately trying to find a loophole to unfreeze his venture capital accounts. He called investors begging for emergency bridge loans, but word of Sienna's father's arrest had already spread through the financial district like wildfire. Nobody would ever touch Richard. He was financially radioactive. His firm was facing a federal audit, and his professional reputation was completely destroyed in a matter of hours. As the sun began to rise over the city, casting a cold morning light into the messy home office, the three of them sat in absolute defeat. They were exhausted, terrified, and staring at total bankruptcy. But Richard, driven by a toxic combination of massive ego and pure delusion, refused to accept reality. He picked up his phone and stared at the email from Aegis Global one more time. His bloodshot eyes scanned the final sentence. "The chairman will see you tomorrow at the final divorce asset division hearing." A twisted, desperate spark of hope suddenly ignited in Richard's eyes. He stood up, straightening his wrinkled tuxedo shirt. He looked at Jamal and Sienna, his voice trembling with manic conviction. "Listen to me," Richard said, pacing the room with renewed energy. "Do you not see what this means? The chairman of Aegis Global is coming to my divorce hearing personally. Why would a trillion-dollar titan waste his time at a family court unless he was planning a massive corporate restructuring? He knows my fund is tied up in the bank. He is stepping in to take control of the assets directly through the divorce settlement to bypass the federal freeze. This is a loyalty test. If I can walk into that courtroom today, look the chairman in the eye and impress him with my financial strategy, I can convince him to bail out the bank, restore the servers, and fully fund my firm. I can save all of us right now." The next morning arrived with a bright, unforgiving sunlight that perfectly highlighted the dark, exhausted circles under their eyes. Richard, Sienna, and Jamal walked up the wide, concrete steps of the downtown courthouse. They were dressed in their absolute best designer clothing, desperately trying to project an aura of untouchable wealth and power. But beneath the expensive Italian fabrics and the heavy layers of Sienna's hastily reapplied makeup, they looked like cornered animals. Their arrogant facades were cracking under the immense crushing weight of their impending financial ruin. Brenda was waiting for them near the metal detectors in the main lobby. Unlike the other three, Brenda had slept perfectly fine. She was completely oblivious to the catastrophic events that had unfolded during the night. She wore a bright pink tailored suit and clutched a designer handbag, looking around the crowded public lobby with a deeply exaggerated expression of disgust. "It is about time you all got here," Brenda complained loudly, her shrill voice echoing off the marble walls and drawing annoyed glances from passing attorneys. "I cannot stand breathing the air in this dreadful place. Richard, you need to make this quick, and I want you to specifically demand that Stella pays for every single cent of your legal fees. After that ridiculous stunt she pulled at your gala last night, parading around in a rented dress with her new sugar daddy security team, she needs to be punished financially. Squeeze that little library mouse for everything she has left." Richard did not have the energy to explain the massive federal bank raid or the frozen venture capital accounts to his mother. His mind was entirely consumed by his desperate delusional fantasy regarding the Aegis Global chairman. He stopped in the middle of the hallway, turning to face a large reflective glass window to aggressively adjust his expensive silk tie. He checked his reflection, practicing his most confident, commanding smile. "Do not worry about the legal fees," Mother Richard said, his voice carrying a manic, fragile edge. "Stella is entirely irrelevant now. Today is not about her or her pathetic little attempts to make us jealous. Today is about securing our empire." He turned to Sienna, who was chewing nervously on her manicured thumbnail, and grabbed her firmly by the shoulders. "Listen to me very carefully," Richard whispered fiercely, his eyes wide and wild. "We walk into that courtroom holding our heads high. We show zero weakness. The chairman of Aegis Global is a shark, and he wants to see if I have the blood to swim in his waters. He orchestrated this entire court meeting to bypass the federal freeze and fund my firm directly. Once I shake the Aegis chairman's hand, we will be billionaires by lunchtime. And Stella will be scrubbing toilets to pay off the debt from that ridiculous dress she rented." Jamal wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, nodding rapidly. "Just get the money, Richard. Just get the money so I can get my server nodes back online before I lose my house." The group made their way down the long, echoing corridor to the assigned family court chamber. They pushed through the heavy wooden double doors and stepped into the quiet room. The space was standard and unremarkable, featuring two large wooden tables facing a raised judge's bench. The room was currently empty. I had not arrived yet, and neither had the mediator. Richard let out a loud, arrogant scoff, taking his seat at the respondent's table. He leaned back in his chair, draping his arm casually over the backrest. "Look at this!" Richard mocked, gesturing to the empty table beside them. "She is probably too terrified to even show up. She knows her little charade is over." Sienna sat closely beside him, taking a deep breath and trying to arrange her face into a look of sophisticated calm. Brenda and Jamal took their seats in the gallery benches right behind them. They waited in the tense silence, their eyes locked eagerly on the heavy wooden doors at the front of the room, expecting a wealthy older billionaire to walk through and hand them the keys to the world. The heavy brass doorknob finally turned. The heavy wooden doors swung open wide. Richard instantly shot up from his chair, buttoning his suit jacket and pasting on his most charming, aggressive business smile, ready to greet his savior. But the smile froze instantly on his face. The person walking through the door was not a corporate billionaire, and it was certainly not the standard family court mediator they had seen just a few days prior. It was the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. He was an incredibly imposing man, with stark white hair and a deeply serious expression, wearing his heavy black judicial robes. And he was not alone. Flanking the Chief Justice on both sides were four heavily armed federal agents, wearing dark suits and tactical earpieces, their hands resting cautiously near their holstered weapons. The sheer authority radiating from the group instantly suffocated the remaining oxygen in the room. Richard swallowed hard, his practiced smile faltering slightly. But his delusional ambition quickly overrode his common sense. His desperate mind instantly rationalized the intense situation. He assumed the federal agents were simply there to provide top-tier security for the incoming billionaire chairman he was so eager to meet. He quickly smoothed his tie again, practically vibrating with nervous energy. The Chief Justice walked past the standard wooden tables and took his seat at the elevated wooden bench, his face completely unreadable. The federal agents silently fanned out, securing the entire perimeter of the courtroom. Two of the heavily armed men took positions flanking the heavy wooden doors, while the other two marched to the front. They stood like immovable stone statues behind an empty, high-backed leather chair positioned directly in the center of the room. This was a new addition. A chair that had not been there during our initial mediation. It was clearly a VIP seat, an imposing throne reserved specifically for the Aegis Global representative. Richard stared at the empty leather chair with absolute reverence. He nudged Sienna, pointing at it discreetly, whispering that their financial savior was moments away. But just as Richard prepared to eagerly approach the judge's bench, the heavy wooden doors opened one more time. I stepped into the courtroom. I was not wearing a rented evening gown, and I was certainly not wearing my old sensible librarian clothes. I wore a perfectly tailored, razor-sharp charcoal business suit, carrying nothing but a sleek, unmarked leather portfolio. My posture was completely straight, my expression entirely unbothered. Richard saw me, and his face instantly twisted into a mask of pure, panicked fury. He darted across the room, intercepting me in the middle aisle. He grabbed my arm roughly, his grip bruising as he tried to forcefully steer me toward the back of the room. "What are you doing? Walking down the center aisle?" Richard hissed, his voice a frantic, aggressive whisper. "I told you to stay out of the way. The chairman of Aegis Global is about to walk through those doors at any second. If a man of his incredible stature sees a pathetic, broke woman like you sitting at the main mediation table, he will think my entire firm is a complete joke. You are going to offend him before I even get a chance to speak. You are going to ruin my one chance to save my venture capital fund and get my accounts unfrozen. Go sit in the absolute back row with my mother, or better yet, turn around and leave the building right now." I stopped walking. I looked down at his hand, aggressively gripping my sleeve. I did not flinch, I did not argue, and I certainly did not pull away. I simply stared at his fingers with cold, terrifying indifference until the heavy, freezing silence made him uncomfortable enough to slowly let go. I did not say a single word to him. I casually adjusted my suit jacket, stepping around him as if he were nothing more than an inconvenient piece of furniture. I continued walking down the center aisle. I walked right past the petitioner's table where my cheap folding chair usually sat. I walked right past Richard's expensive legal team, ignoring their confused stares. I walked directly to the absolute center of the room, approaching the heavy, high-backed leather chair, guarded by the federal agents. This was the exact seat Richard believed was meant for his billionaire savior. I calmly pulled the heavy chair out, smoothed my suit trousers, and sat down directly in the center VIP position. I placed my unmarked leather portfolio on the polished mahogany table in front of me, folded my hands perfectly still, and looked up at the Chief Justice. The entire courtroom froze. The silence was so absolute, you could hear the subtle ticking of the wall clock. Richard's brain completely short-circuited. He stared at me sitting calmly in the absolute seat of power, flanked by federal security, and his fragile, desperate ego violently snapped. He completely lost whatever tiny fraction of composure he had left. "Get out of that chair right now!" Richard screamed, his voice echoing violently off the high ceilings as he lunged forward, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of purple. "That seat is reserved for the Aegis chairman. You are going to get us all thrown in federal prison." He did not even make it 2 steps. Before Richard could get anywhere near my table, the 2 federal agents standing directly behind my chair stepped forward simultaneously. They moved with terrifying, synchronized precision, placing their hands firmly on the grips of their holstered weapons. "Step back immediately, sir." The lead agent barked, his voice, carrying the lethal, unquestionable authority of the federal government. "Take one more step toward the chairwoman, and you will be forcefully detained." Richard froze mid-step, the angry red color instantly draining from his face, as the reality of the federal agent's lethal threat washed over him. He stared at the hand resting firmly on the holstered weapon, his arrogant chest suddenly heaving with panicked breaths. He slowly raised his hands in a gesture of surrender and took 3 deliberate steps backward. He stumbled slightly as he retreated to the respondent's table, practically falling into the cheap wooden chair next to Sienna. He tugged nervously at his collar, his eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately trying to construct a narrative that made sense to his massive ego. He simply could not accept that the federal agents were protecting me. His brain immediately twisted the agent's warning. He convinced himself the guard had sarcastically called me chairwoman to mock my arrogant seating choice, or that I was simply keeping the seat warm for the real billionaire who was about to walk through the doors. Before Richard could open his mouth to complain about the rough treatment, the Chief Justice leaned forward over the elevated wooden bench. He raised his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down with a thunderous, deafening crack. The sharp sound echoed violently off the high ceilings, instantly silencing the lingering murmurs from Richard's legal team and completely commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. This court is now in session. The Chief Justice announced, his deep, gravelly voice radiating an unquestionable, terrifying authority. I advise everyone in this room to remain seated and remain completely silent. Any further outbursts or aggressive movements will result in immediate federal detainment. The Chief Justice adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the thick stack of highly classified documents resting on his bench. He did not look at Richard's expensive divorce lawyer. He did not acknowledge the trivial family court paperwork that had brought us here. Instead, he folded his hands together and delivered the words that would officially rewrite the entire financial landscape of the country. Let the record show that the standard dissolution of marriage proceedings formally scheduled for this morning have been officially superseded by federal jurisdiction, the Chief Justice declared smoothly. We are no longer conducting a simple family court settlement. This hearing has been legally repurposed. By direct order of the federal judiciary, we are here today to execute a binding mandate regarding the unsealing and complete transfer of the Aegis Global Trust, exactly as required by the late founder's ironclad will. A collective gasp rippled through Richard's side of the room. Sienna gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning completely white. Brenda leaned forward in the gallery, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. But it was Richard who reacted the most dramatically. Despite the fact that his venture capital firm was currently frozen, his mistress's father was facing federal prison, and I was sitting directly in the center VIP chair flanked by armed guards. Richard's delusional arrogance reached an absolute peak. He heard the words Aegis Global Trust, and his mind completely erased every single negative consequence of the past 24 hours. He genuinely believed his manic theory was unfolding perfectly. Richard turned around in his chair, leaning over the low wooden railing separating the tables from the gallery. He looked directly at Jamal, who was still sweating profusely from his massive crypto losses. Richard flashed a wild, triumphant smirk that stretched from ear to ear. "See?" Richard whispered loudly, his voice vibrating with absolute, unfiltered greed. "I told you exactly what was going to happen. The chairman is using my divorce proceeding as a legal smokescreen to execute a massive corporate merger. He froze the bank to test my resilience, and now he is stepping in to personally fund my firm. I am the chosen one, Jamal. We are about to be untouchable billionaires." Jamal wiped his forehead with a trembling hand, a desperate smile finally breaking through his panic. He nodded frantically, fully buying into Richard's insane fantasy. They both turned their attention back to the front of the room, practically vibrating in their seats, as they waited for an imaginary older gentleman to walk out of the judge's chambers and hand them a massive fortune. The Chief Justice completely ignored Richard's obnoxious whispering. He gestured to the senior legal counsel standing near the bench. The lawyer stepped forward carrying a small, velvet-lined tray. Resting precisely in the center of the tray was an old, thick parchment envelope. The Chief Justice reached down and picked up the heavy envelope. It was secured shut with a massive pool of dark crimson wax, deeply stamped with the imposing crest of Aegis Global. He held it up for the official court cameras to record. He looked directly at me, offering a subtle, respectful nod, and then he firmly broke the wax seal. The loud, crisp snap of the breaking seal echoed through the space, and the entire room went absolutely terrifyingly dead silent. The loud, crisp snap of the breaking seal echoed through the space, and the entire room went absolutely terrifyingly dead silent. The Chief Justice pulled a thick stack of aged, heavy parchment from the envelope. He smoothed the pages flat against the polished wood of his elevated bench. The silence in the courtroom was so profound and heavy that you could hear the subtle rustle of the thick paper shifting. He adjusted his reading glasses, his expression entirely stoic, and began to read aloud. His deep voice carried the absolute, unyielding weight of federal law. Let the record reflect the unsealing of the Master Trust document for Aegis Global, the Chief Justice declared smoothly. I will now read the official summary of the holding company's primary assets into the record to establish the sheer scale and magnitude of this federal transfer. He paused, running his index finger deliberately down the first page of the ancient document. The Aegis Global Trust currently holds undisputed outright ownership of 40% of the critical data center infrastructure across the entire United States. This staggering portfolio includes the primary server farms powering the Eastern Seaboard's financial sector, the Western technology corridors, and the most secure encrypted communication networks in the world. Jamal gasped audibly. He leaned over the low wooden railing, separating the gallery from the main floor, his eyes practically bulging out of his head. 40%, Jamal whispered frantically, his voice shaking with absolute disbelief. Richard, do you understand what that means? If you get even a tiny fraction of that control for your new fund, I can run 1,000,000 crypto nodes on premium bandwidth. I can get my servers back online today. We can buy matching mega yachts by next week. We will be kings. Richard did not even turn around to look at his desperate brother-in-law. He was completely mesmerized, practically salivating as he stared up at the Chief Justice. He gripped the edge of the respondent's table so tightly that his knuckles turned stark white. He was already spending the limitless money in his mind, envisioning himself ringing the opening bell on Wall Street, flanked by supermodels and boarding private jets. He genuinely believed this massive, unprecedented empire was being handed to him on a silver platter because of his brilliant venture capital networking. Furthermore, the Chief Justice continued turning to the next heavy page. The trust retains exclusive rights and full ownership of over 3,000 core artificial intelligence patents. These specific patents form the foundational, irreplaceable architecture for modern global telecommunications, defense networking, and automated banking systems. The real estate portfolio also includes prime unencumbered commercial skyscrapers in Manhattan, London, Tokyo, and Geneva. Sienna let out a breathless, desperate sound. She pressed her manicured hands against her chest, her mind instantly calculating how many designer bags, luxury sports cars, and private islands she could buy once Richard secured this massive partnership. She completely forgot about her father currently suffering a severe heart attack in federal custody. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the wealth being described temporarily erased every single one of her problems. She looked at Richard with absolute worship, thinking she had successfully tied herself to the wealthiest man on the planet. Brenda, however, was getting restless in the gallery. She kept shifting in her hard wooden seat, craning her neck to look over her shoulder at the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. She frowned deeply, tapping her expensive designer handbag impatiently against her knee. "Where is he?" Brenda whispered loudly to Jamal, her tone laced with wealthy entitlement. "The judge is reading the list of all these magnificent assets, but the billionaire chairman is still not here. Is he going to make a dramatic entrance at the end?" Richard needs to be ready to stand up, shake his hand, and close the deal immediately. Richard nodded sharply at his mother's words, aggressively adjusting his expensive silk tie one more time. He sat up completely straight, puffing out his chest, ready to leap to his feet the moment an older distinguished gentleman walked through those doors to claim the empty throne. He was completely blind to the fact that the throne was already occupied. The combined market valuation of these physical assets, intellectual property, and liquid capital reserves, the Chief Justice announced, his voice echoing with absolute finality, is currently verified at $1.2 trillion. $1 trillion. The massive number hung in the air, heavy and almost completely incomprehensible to the human mind. It was not just extreme wealth, it was world-altering power. It was the kind of money that could buy and sell entire governments without blinking. The Chief Justice slowly lowered the heavy parchment. He stacked the papers neatly on his bench, aligning the edges with meticulous precision. He took off his reading glasses and folded them slowly. He did not look at the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room. He did not look at Richard's eager, salivating face. The Chief Justice looked directly at the center of the room. He looked past the two armed federal agents, focusing his sharp, intelligent gaze entirely on me. Richard noticed the judge's shifting gaze. He frowned deeply, his arrogant, greedy smile faltering slightly as he realized the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court was looking right at the woman he had just divorced and tossed onto the street. As explicitly stipulated in the founding documents, the Chief Justice said, his voice softer now, but carrying a profound, unquestionable respect. The total transfer of this monumental trust was completely contingent upon two specific conditions. The first was the sole beneficiary reaching her 33rd birthday. The second was the legal binding severance of all parasitic, opportunistic financial ties. The Chief Justice picked up a secondary piece of paper. It was the heavily biased post-nuptial divorce decree Richard had aggressively forced me to sign just 24 hours ago. The judge held it up for the entire room to see. With the filing of this final waiver yesterday afternoon, both conditions have been flawlessly met, the Chief Justice declared. He looked directly into my eyes, and to the absolute horror of everyone sitting at the respondents' table, the highest-ranking judge in the state slowly bowed his head. As stipulated upon her 33rd birthday and the legal severance of all parasitic ties, the sole beneficiary is recognized. The Chief Justice said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Congratulations, Chairwoman Stella. Congratulations, Chairwoman Stella. The words left the Chief Justice's mouth and seemed to hang suspended in the perfectly still air of the courtroom. Chairwoman Stella. The syllables echoed off the polished mahogany walls, bouncing back to strike Richard and his pathetic entourage with the devastating force of a physical blow. Time seemed to grind to an absolute halt. I sat perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair, my hands folded neatly on my leather portfolio, watching the spectacular slow-motion collapse of their entire reality. Richard completely stopped breathing. His chest, which had been puffed out with such profound, arrogant pride just seconds before, completely caved in. The smug, greedy smile that had been plastered across his face practically melted off, sliding away to reveal a mask of sheer, unadulterated horror. His eyes widened to an unnatural degree, locked onto me in absolute terror. He stared at my tailored charcoal suit, my calm expression, and the federal agents guarding my flanks, his brain desperately trying to reject the impossible truth. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff in the dark, experiencing that agonizing, terrifying moment of weightlessness before the fatal impact. Next to him, Sienna's perfectly manicured hands went entirely limp. The heavy, exclusive designer handbag she had been clutching like a lifeline slipped from her fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud, the sound completely ignored by everyone in the room. Her jaw went slack. The vibrant color drained completely out of her face, leaving her spray-tanned skin looking pale and sickly. Her mind, already fractured by the news of her father's federal arrest and total bankruptcy, finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The woman she had mercilessly mocked, the woman she had thrown $100 bill at for a cab ride, was the anonymous billionaire who had just legally destroyed her family's entire banking empire. Behind them in the gallery, the physical reactions were even more severe. Jamal let out a strange high-pitched wheeze. His knees completely gave out beneath him. The massive sudden loss of his crypto empire and the terrifying realization of who controlled the server farms hit him like a freight train. He collapsed forward, his heavy body slamming into the low wooden railing separating the gallery from the tables. He gripped the polished wood with white-knuckled desperation, trying to keep himself from sliding completely onto the floor. His bright blue velvet jacket was completely soaked in cold sweat. He stared at me, his eyes glassy and vacant, realizing that the sister-in-law he had relentlessly bullied was the undisputed owner of the digital infrastructure he relied on to survive. Brenda made a sickening, wet, choking sound. She clutched her expensive silk blouse right over her heart, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled out of water. The pristine elitist hierarchy she had worshipped her entire life had just been violently flipped upside down. The uncultured orphan she had banned from sitting at the head of her holiday table was now sitting on a trillion-dollar throne recognized by the highest levels of the federal government. Brenda slumped back against the hard wooden bench, her designer handbag slipping off her lap, her eyes rolling back slightly as she struggled to pull oxygen into her panic-stricken lungs. She realized in that exact moment that she had traded genuine loyalty for absolute, humiliating ruin. I did not offer them a single ounce of Vaisadaji Wodi. Okay. I did not offer them a single ounce of pity. I simply watched them drown in the terrifying consequences of their own monstrous greed. They had spent years building a house of cards on top of my quiet patience, and now a hurricane had arrived. Finally, Richard's paralyzed lungs forcefully dragged in a ragged, desperate breath. His chest heaved violently. His brain simply broke under the sheer weight of his monumental miscalculation. He could not accept that he had legally locked himself out of a trillion-dollar inheritance just 24 hours ago. He scrambled to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. He pointed a violently shaking finger at me, his eyes wild and completely unhinged. "No!" Richard stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "No, this is wrong. She fixes old books. She is broke. She worked at a public library. This is a massive fraud. She does not own any data centers. She does not own any patents. You are making a terrible mistake, Your Honor. She is lying to you, just to get back at me." I looked at his shaking finger and let out a soft, humorless laugh. My voice when I finally spoke was completely cold and commanding. It cut through his pathetic whining and filled every single corner of the quiet courtroom. "There is no mistake, Richard," I said smoothly. "And I am not lying. The woman who fixed old books, the woman who worked 3 minimum wage shifts to pay for your expensive master degree, was a carefully designed test. It was a test you failed in the most spectacular, humiliating way possible." I leaned forward in my leather chair, resting my hands on the mahogany table. My father built Aegis Global from the ground up. He was a brilliant man, but he knew exactly what massive wealth does to people. He knew it attracts greedy, parasitic individuals who would try to use me to elevate their own pathetic ambitions. He was terrified that I would fall into the hands of a gold digger. He wanted me to experience the real world. He wanted me to find a true partner who loved me for my loyalty and my character, not for my trillion-dollar portfolio. So he locked my true identity away. He placed my entire inheritance into a blind trust, completely sealed until my 33rd birthday, with one ironclad condition. I had to be legally severed from any opportunistic leeches before I could take my rightful place on the throne. I watched Richard swallow hard, his throat working frantically as the pieces began to snap together in his mind. "You thought you were so incredibly smart?" I continued, my voice never rising above a calm, lethal register. "For 7 years, I played the role of the devoted, exhausted wife. I watched you take my hard-earned money and use it to build your arrogant venture capital fantasies. I listened to your mother degrade my orphan background at every single holiday dinner. I tolerated Jamal eating my food and sleeping on my couch while he mocked my thrift store clothes. I gave you every opportunity to be a decent human being." I stood up slowly. The federal agents behind me adjusted their stances, their eyes locked on Richard. "But 3 days ago you reached the absolute peak of your delusion," I said, taking a slow step to the side of the table. "You sat across from me in the mediation room, laughed directly in my face, and threw a $5,000 check at me like I was a desperate beggar. You watched your new mistress throw a $100 bill at my feet. Your mother threw my precious antique tools onto the front lawn and called them garbage. You told me I brought absolutely no value to your life. You told me I was dead weight." Sienna whimpered from the table, burying her face in her hands. "So, I decided to show you exactly how much value I control," I announced, my words striking them like physical blows. Over the last 72 hours, I did not just sit in a rented apartment crying over our broken marriage. I took my rightful place as the chairwoman of Aegis Global, and I systematically dismantled your entire universe. It took exactly 3 phone calls to erase everything you thought you owned. I looked directly at Sienna. "I am the anonymous institutional lender who executed the hostile takeover of your father's commercial bank. I am the one who called in his massive loans and sent the federal agents to his corporate headquarters to arrest him for fraud." I shifted my gaze to Jamal in the gallery. "Jamal, I am the owner of the data centers who permanently terminated your crypto mining nodes. I flagged your account, shut off your bandwidth, and forced the liquidation of your highly leveraged trades. Cut off your bridge loans, and ordered the federal audit that will permanently end your pathetic career. I ruined all of you before you even woke up this morning." The courtroom was dead silent. The absolute magnitude of my revenge hung heavily in the air. Richard stared at me, his chest heaving. The realization of what I had done washed over him, but instead of feeling remorse or absolute defeat, the sheer scale of the money completely warped his fragile mind. His brain simply could not process losing $1 trillion. The terror in his eyes suddenly vanished, replaced by a blinding psychotic greed. He started to chuckle. The chuckle grew into a loud, maniacal laugh that echoed wildly off the mahogany walls. "Wait!" Richard shouted, his face stretching into a terrifying, greedy grin. "Wait just a minute. You inherited this money. But we were legally married for 7 years. We built a life together in this state. You acquired this massive asset during our marriage. Half of that $1 trillion trust is legally mine. Under state law, I own half." I let his words hang in the air for a moment. Richard was practically vibrating with a sudden manic joy. His greedy mind had instantly calculated the math. $600 billion. He genuinely believed that despite everything he had done, despite the absolute cruelty he had subjected me to the family court legal system, was going to reward him with exactly half of my empire. He looked at Sienna, who had stopped crying on the floor and was now staring up at him with a desperate, reignited flicker of hope. He looked at Jamal, who was pulling himself up by the heavy wooden railing, suddenly thinking his crypto servers might be saved and his massive debts erased. They all thought they had found the ultimate legal loophole. They thought they had snatched an impossible victory from the jaws of absolute defeat. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with his aggressive interpretation of state marital property laws. I did not even look at his overpriced divorce lawyer, who was currently staring at his client with an expression of profound, dawning horror. Instead, I reached into my unmarked leather portfolio. I pulled out a single thick stack of textured legal paper. It was not a document drafted by my corporate legal team. It was the exact document his slick, highly paid venture capital lawyer had aggressively pushed across the mediation table just yesterday morning. I placed my hand flat on the heavy paper and slid it smoothly across the polished mahogany table. It came to a stop directly in front of Richard, right next to his trembling hands. "Do you recognize this, Richard?" I asked quietly, my voice perfectly steady in the chaotic room. Richard looked down at the document. His manic, triumphant grin faltered slightly as his eyes scanned the bold legal header. It was the heavily biased, post-nuptial divorce decree, the absolute trap he had so proudly built and forced me to walk into. "You were so incredibly terrified that I would try to take a tiny fraction of your future venture capital money," I said, my words echoing with pure lethal irony. "You bragged about closing a $500 million deal. You told me you needed to protect your massive success from a broke, pathetic woman who only knew how to glue antique books together. You demanded an ironclad legal barrier so I could never touch a single penny of your wealth. You wanted me locked out of your high-class future forever." Richard stared at his own signature at the absolute bottom of the page. The heavy black ink from his expensive gold fountain pen looked like a physical chain binding him directly to his own doom. I leaned forward, tapping my manicured fingernail directly on the fourth page of the document. "Let me read your own brilliantly crafted clause back to you," I said. I spoke slowly, clearly enunciating every single word so it would burn permanently into his memory. "Both parties completely and permanently waive all rights to any current and future undiscovered assets." The Chief Justice leaned forward from his elevated bench, confirming my statement with the heavy weight of the law. "That document was legally filed and fully authenticated by the court yesterday afternoon," the Chief Justice stated, his voice completely void of any sympathy. "It is an ironclad, unbreakable financial severance under state jurisdiction. You hold absolutely no legal claim to the Aegis Global Trust or any of the chairwoman's assets." The realization did not hit Richard all at once. It crashed down on him in agonizing, suffocating waves. He looked at the paper. He looked at me. He looked at the Chief Justice. He had forcefully instructed his lawyer to draft that specific clause. He had forced me to sign that document. He had mocked me while I pretended to hesitate. He had laughed right in my face, completely unaware that his own supreme arrogance was blinding him to the biggest financial blunder in human history. Because he was so desperately greedy to protect a mere $500 million from the woman who supported him, he had legally and permanently locked himself out of a $1.2 trillion empire. The math finalized in his breaking brain. $600 billion. He had literally held his gold pen, smiled directly at me, and happily signed away $600 billion of pure, untouchable wealth. The fragile manic hope in Richard's eyes instantly shattered into a million pieces of absolute despair. The human mind is simply not built to process a loss of that incomprehensible magnitude, especially a loss entirely caused by its own malicious stupidity. Richard let out a sound that was not entirely human. It was a guttural, agonizing scream that tore from the deepest, darkest pit of his chest. He collapsed forward onto the table. He grabbed the heavy legal document, his hands shaking so violently the paper crumpled in his fists. But destroying the paper could not undo the legal reality. He raised his hands to his head, burying his fingers deep into his perfectly styled hair. He pulled and tore at his own hair, screaming in pure, unadulterated mental agony as the reality of his monumental failure completely consumed his shattered mind. I watched him tear at his own hair, his agonizing screams echoing through the silent courtroom. For 7 long years, I had quietly absorbed his insults, his financial abuse, and his overwhelming arrogance. I had waited for the exact moment when his greed would eclipse his logic. Watching him completely break down over the devastating consequences of his own signature, I felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical satisfaction. I did not ask the heavily armed federal agents to silence his pathetic outburst. I simply sat back in my high-backed leather chair and let him scream. I let him wail until his vocal cords finally gave out, until his manic, psychotic energy completely drained away, leaving him slumped awkwardly over the polished mahogany table. He was a hollow, broken shell of the confident man who had strutted into the room just 20 minutes prior. But the loss of his imaginary $600 billion was only the beginning of his punishment. Losing the money was merely his emotional destruction. Now it was time for the swift legal execution. I turned my attention away from Richard's sobbing, pathetic form and looked up at the Chief Justice. I reached back into my unmarked leather portfolio. I bypassed the standard family court forms and pulled out 3 thick, heavily bound dossiers. They were securely stamped with the dark red seal of the Federal Financial Crimes Division. I handed the heavy folders directly to the lead federal agent standing to my right. These files contain the complete, unedited internal ledgers from the commercial bank owned by Sienna's father. I stated calmly, projecting my voice so every single person in the room could hear the final nail being driven into their coffins. My corporate intelligence team at Aegis Global spent the last 48 hours conducting a comprehensive forensic audit of their entire banking operation. We did not just uncover massive institutional failure. We uncovered a highly coordinated, deeply illegal money laundering scheme designed to artificially inflate the bank's stock value while simultaneously hiding millions of dollars in toxic, unrecoverable debt. Sienna stopped crying immediately. She looked up from the floor, her tear-streaked face twisting in absolute terrified confusion. But it was my next sentence that completely shattered whatever tiny, fragile alliance still existed between her and Richard. And the primary architect of that illegal scheme, I continued pointing my manicured finger directly at my ex-husband, was Richard. In order to secure the massive bridge loans he desperately needed to launch his new venture capital fund, Richard actively helped her father falsify the federal reporting documents. He utilized his high-level financial credentials to hide the stolen money in untraceable offshore shell companies. He is deeply, unequivocally complicit in the exact corporate fraud that just completely destroyed her family. Sienna scrambled to her feet, her designer heels slipping slightly on the polished hardwood floor. The horrifying realization hit her like a physical blow to the chest. Richard had not just failed to magically save her father from the Aegis Global takeover. Richard was the exact reason the federal agents had raided the bank in the first place. His reckless greed and illegal financial maneuvering had drawn the immediate attention of the federal authorities and single-handedly triggered the collapse of her entire luxurious life. She lunged across the short distance separating them. She grabbed Richard fiercely by the lapels of his expensive Italian suit and violently yanked him upward. "You ruined us!" Sienna screamed, her voice completely raw and hysterical. "You used my father to fund your pathetic dreams. You promised us an empire, and you dragged my family straight into a federal prison. You disgusting, arrogant liar!" She pulled one hand back and slapped him incredibly hard across the face. The sharp, violent crack of her hand hitting his cheek echoed loudly in the silent room. She slapped him again, her heavy designer rings cutting deeply into his skin, screaming at him to fix it, demanding that he magically undo the absolute catastrophe he had just caused. Richard did not even try to defend himself. He did not raise his hands to block her frantic, painful blows. He simply let his head snap back and forth with every single violent slap. His eyes were completely vacant, staring blankly at the crumpled post-nuptial waiver resting on the table. His mind was entirely gone, permanently trapped in the agonizing realization that he had willingly signed away a $1 trillion fortune. He was completely catatonic. Sienna raised her hand to strike him a third time, but she never got the chance. The lead federal agent stepped smoothly around my chair. He grabbed Sienna forcefully by the wrist, easily restraining her frantic movements. The agent then reached back to his tactical belt, producing heavy steel handcuffs. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around Sienna's wrists with a sharp metallic snap that echoed through the courtroom. She gasped, looking down at the cold metal binding her hands, the reality of her new life finally crashing down upon her. The federal agent pulled her arms behind her back, reading her Miranda rights in a bored, monotone voice that only amplified her absolute humiliation. Richard remained slumped over the table, completely unresponsive to Sienna's frantic screaming, as the agent forcefully escorted her away from the respondent's table. The grand, arrogant empire they had hallucinated just an hour ago was now a crime scene. While the entire room was captivated by Sienna's dramatic arrest and Richard's catatonic breakdown movement in the back of the gallery caught my eye, it was Jamal. The loud, obnoxious crypto broker who had spent years eating my food and insulting my clothes had suddenly gone completely silent. He was practically dripping with cold sweat, his bright blue velvet jacket stained dark with fear. Seeing Sienna in handcuffs had finally broken through his thick skull. He realized that if my intelligence team had audited Sienna's father's bank, they had undoubtedly audited his digital footprint as well. Jamal slowly slid off the wooden gallery bench. He kept his head down, crouching slightly as he tried to blend into the shadows of the back row. He took slow, agonizingly quiet steps toward the heavy double doors at the rear of the courtroom. He thought the federal agents were too distracted by Sienna to notice him. He thought he could just slip out a trembling hand, his fingers mere inches from the brass doorknob. I did not raise my voice to stop him. I simply raised my right hand and snapped my fingers. The sharp sound cut through Sienna's fading sobs like a whip. Instantly, the two heavily armed federal agents stationed at the rear exit moved into action. Before Jamal's fingers could even brush the brass handle, the agent stepped firmly in front of the heavy wooden doors, crossing their muscular arms and completely blocking his path. Jamal froze, letting out a pathetic squeak of terror as he stared up at the stone-faced guards. He slowly turned around, his eyes wide and pleading, looking directly at me, sitting calmly at the front of the room. "Where exactly do you think you are going, Jamal?" I asked, my voice projecting effortlessly across the silent courtroom. "Did you really think I would meticulously dismantle Richard's firm and Sienna's bank, but somehow forget about the parasite living on my couch?" Jamal swallowed hard, his hands shaking violently at his sides. "Stella, please," he stammered, his booming voice reduced to a pathetic, breathy whisper. "I did not do anything illegal. My servers just crashed. I am just a guy trying to make a living on the blockchain. You already shut down my nodes. I lost everything. Is that not enough punishment?" I stood up from the VIP chair and walked slowly down the center aisle, stopping just a few feet away from where he stood trembling. "Trying to make a living," I repeated, letting out a cold, dismissive laugh. "My corporate intelligence team pulled the server logs, Jamal. We know exactly how you funded those massive crypto nodes. You were not just making bad investments. You were utilizing heavily encrypted illegal backdoor protocols to siphon massive amounts of stolen electricity directly from the municipal grid to power your mining rigs." Jamal's face turned completely ashen. He took a stumbling step backward, but the federal agents stood like brick walls behind him. "And it gets much worse," I continued, my voice echoing with lethal precision. "You used your brother-in-law's venture capital firm as a digital shield. You illegally accessed Richard's secure trading algorithms to front-run corporate investments, using insider trading protocols to manipulate your own crypto wallets. You committed massive federal wire fraud, energy theft, and corporate espionage. The evidence is completely undeniable, and it has already been handed over to the Securities and Exchange Commission." The last ounce of fake bravado vanished from Jamal's body. His knees completely buckled. The man who had mocked my cheap clothes and laughed at my $5,000 divorce settlement collapsed onto the hardwood floor. He fell entirely to his knees, clasping his hands together in a pathetic gesture of prayer. Hot tears streamed down his face, ruining his arrogant facade. "Stella, please," Jamal sobbed, crawling forward on his knees until he was practically groveling at my feet. "Please, you cannot do this to me. I will go to federal prison for decades. We are family. You are my beloved sister-in-law. I was just joking around before. I always respected you. Please show me some mercy. I have absolutely no money left." I looked down at the pathetic man groveling on the floor. I reached into the side pocket of my pristine suit jacket. My fingers brushed against the crisp piece of paper I had saved from the mediation room. I pulled it out and looked at it. It was the exact $100 bill Sienna had thrown at me, the money Jamal had laughed at while telling me to take a cheap cab home. I held the crisp bill between my fingers, letting it catch the light. I looked down into his desperate, crying eyes, with absolute freezing indifference. "You told me to take a cab with $100? I said softly, my voice devoid of any mercy. I let the bill slip from my fingers. It fluttered down slowly, landing perfectly on his tear-stained velvet shoulder. "I think you will need this for the prison bus." I watched the crisp $100 bill settle onto Jamal's trembling shoulder, sealing his pathetic fate. He did not even try to brush it off. He simply stared blankly at the polished hardwood floor, completely paralyzed by the terrifying reality of his impending federal prosecution. The courtroom was eerily quiet for a brief moment, the silence only broken by the faint muffled sounds of Sienna continuing to scream hysterically out in the corridor as she was dragged toward the holding cells. Then a sudden piercing wail shattered the stillness inside the room. It was an ugly, desperate sound of pure panic. I looked toward the gallery. Brenda was clambering clumsily over the low wooden railing. Her tailored pink designer suit, which she had worn like a royal uniform just an hour ago, was now wrinkled and disheveled. She dropped her expensive luxury handbag, leaving it abandoned on the wooden bench. Brenda hit the floor heavily, her knees slamming against the hardwood, but she did not stand up. Instead, she began to literally crawl across the center aisle toward me. "Stella, my sweet girl Brenda," wailed her shrill voice, completely cracking under the weight of her absolute desperation. Heavy tears streamed down her face, ruining her perfect, expensive makeup and leaving dark streaks of mascara running down her cheeks. She crawled closer, reaching her trembling manicured hands out, as if she were trying to grab the hem of my tailored charcoal trousers. "Please, Stella, my beautiful daughter." I took a sharp, deliberate step backward. The physical revulsion I felt for this woman was overwhelming. I looked down at her crawling on the floor with absolute unfiltered disgust. "Do not touch me, Brenda," I commanded, my voice cold and hard as steel. "And do not ever call me your daughter again." Brenda recoiled slightly but kept her hands clasped tightly together in front of her chest, begging like a desperate animal. "I am so sorry," she sobbed loudly, bowing her head toward my shoes. "I was a monster. I was a foolish, shallow, wicked old woman blinded by money and status. I treated you so terribly, but I know you have a good heart. You always had such a pure, forgiving heart. Please, Stella, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Do not send my boy to federal prison. He made a terrible mistake, but he can fix it. Let Richard come home to you. He loves you. He has always loved you. We are your family." "Family," I repeated, letting the word hang heavily in the cold air of the courtroom. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You do not have the slightest idea what that word actually means." I looked down at her weeping, pathetic form, feeling a deep sense of closure. "For 7 years, you made it your absolute mission to ensure I knew I was an unwanted outsider. You constantly reminded me that I was an uncultured orphan who did not deserve to breathe the same air as your brilliant son. You intentionally sat me at the far end of every holiday table. Yesterday, you literally threw my mother's precious antique restoration tools into the dirt and proudly called my heritage garbage. You built your entire identity around the fragile, pathetic illusion of high society judging human beings exclusively by their net worth." Brenda whimpered, squeezing her eyes shut as her own cruel history was thrown back in her face. "True family is built entirely on loyalty, Brenda," I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "It is built on standing by someone when they have absolutely nothing. You threw me away like trash for a $5,000 check and a woman whose father you falsely believed could buy you a bigger house. Now look at you. You are completely stripped of your fake royalty, begging on the dirty floor of a family court. You are going to return to your exclusive country club with absolutely nothing but the humiliating reality that your son is a convicted federal felon. You have no status left." I turned my back on her, completely severing my attention. I left Brenda sobbing uncontrollably on the floor, her entire world shattered beyond repair. I looked directly at the lead federal agent standing near the respondent's table and gave him a single sharp nod. The agent moved immediately. He stepped up behind Richard, who was still slumped over the table staring blankly into space. "Richard, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud and massive corporate money laundering," the agent announced firmly. The agent grabbed Richard's wrists, pulling his arms forcefully behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs, snapping shut around his wrists, acted like a violent electric shock. The cold steel instantly snapped Richard out of his catatonic trance. The terrifying reality of prison finally pierced through his broken mind. Richard gasped, his eyes flying wide open with pure, unadulterated terror. As the federal agents hauled him roughly to his feet, he began to struggle wildly. He dug the heels of his expensive Italian shoes into the polished floor, fighting the inevitable with every ounce of his remaining strength. He twisted his head around his eyes, locking onto me with a look of absolute soul-crushing desperation. Stella Richard screamed, his voice tearing his vocal cords as the agents forcefully dragged him backward toward the heavy double doors. "Stella, wait! Please!" He thrashed violently against the unyielding grip of the federal agents, his perfectly styled hair now a chaotic, sweaty mess. "I am sorry," he wailed, tears of pure terror streaming down his face. "I made a huge mistake. Give me one more chance. I love you, Stella. You are my wife. Please do not let them take me." The heavy oak doors of the courtroom slammed shut behind me with a loud, absolute thud, instantly cutting off Richard's frantic, wailing pleas for a second chance. The heavy, suffocating air of the family court proceedings, thick with greed and manipulation, was completely sealed inside with him. Stepping out onto the broad, white marble steps of the courthouse, the bright midday sun immediately warmed my face. I took a deep, untroubled breath of the crisp city air. I had entered this building hours ago as an allegedly broke, desperate woman facing an arrogant adversary. I was leaving it as the undisputed architect of his total, unequivocal destruction. Down at the street level, the chaotic traffic of the city moved with its usual relentless energy, completely oblivious to the colossal shift in power that had just occurred. But waiting for me at the base of the long courthouse stairs was a scene that belonged to an entirely different world. A fleet of 5 pristine, unmarked black SUVs, armored and gleaming perfectly under the sun, sat idling in a rigid, synchronized line. Surrounding the vehicles were my elite security details and members of my executive intelligence team, their dark suits cutting a sharp contrast against the pale marble. As I began my descent down the wide steps, the lead security officer from the courtroom walked briskly ahead, opening the heavy reinforced door of the center Maybach SUV. He stood at perfect attention, waiting to escort me away from the wreckage of my old life. I walked down the steps with slow, deliberate precision. I did not rush. I did not look over my shoulder. Every single step I took felt lighter, shedding the accumulated weight of 7 years of condescension and betrayal. Richard, Sienna, Brenda, and Jamal had all desperately tried to reduce my worth to a single insulting number written on a $5,000 check. They thought their fragile status and borrowed money gave them the absolute right to discard me like trash. But they failed to understand the most dangerous truth about pushing someone into the dark. Sometimes that person learns exactly how to see in the dark, and they emerge commanding the shadows. I reached the bottom of the steps. The lead security officer offered a slight respectful bow as I approached the open door of the Maybach. "Is everything secured, Mr. Harrison?" I asked quietly, looking toward my chief trustee, who was waiting by the vehicle. "Every single directive has been flawlessly executed, Madam Chairwoman," Mr. Harrison replied smoothly, handing me a fresh, encrypted titanium tablet. "The federal authorities have formally assumed full control of the commercial bank and the venture capital fund. The crypto mining networks are permanently liquidated. The legal severance is absolute. Your trillion-dollar portfolio is completely untethered and fully operational. Where shall we direct the convoy?" I looked at the tablet, briefly scanning the final confirmation reports of their financial devastation. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I simply felt the profound, satisfying equilibrium of absolute justice. I handed the tablet back to him and stepped up into the luxurious leather interior of the armored SUV. "Take me to the global headquarters," I instructed, my voice calm and commanding. "It is time to get to work." The heavy armored door closed with a solid, reassuring sound, sealing me inside the quiet sanctuary of the vehicle. The entire convoy moved in perfect synchronization, pulling smoothly away from the courthouse curb and merging flawlessly into the heavy city traffic. I leaned back into the plush leather seat, watching the massive, imposing facade of the courthouse fade away in the rearview mirror. I was leaving the trash exactly where it belonged, locked inside the federal system, completely destroyed by their own monstrous greed. Sometimes the trash takes itself out, and in Richard's case, his own monumental greed was the incinerator. Have you ever had someone significantly underestimate your worth, only to deeply, painfully regret it when you finally showed them exactly who you truly are? Let me know your story in the comments below. If you loved seeing Richard aggressively sign away his own billion-dollar salvation and absolutely destroy his own life, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who needs a reminder to never ever let anyone treat them like they are broke. Your value is defined by your own strength, not by the limited imagination of those who try to keep you down. A lesson clearly illustrated throughout this story is that trying to build wealth unethically while mistreating others is a formula for failure. While wealth may provide a temporary facade, true power is cultivated through knowledge and holding on to empathy, particularly toward the seemingly powerless. Let this serve as a reminder to always embrace kindness, as it requires zero capital but yields immeasurable rewards.